On the bench today, we've got a Duke's pressurization controller off an Aerostar, 3 of them actually. These are all the same, pretty much the same part number, or the same model. The difference here, this one has a slightly different style motor on it than this one does. This is typically what you see on Aerostar controller. So the way this thing works, we mentioned in a previous video that the way the pressurization controller works is by sending a pneumatic signal, or in other words an air signal, back to the outflow valve, which is in the back of the cabin on the Aerostar behind the hatch shelf. So this thing has a filter here that screws in like this, and this filter of course is exposed to cabin pressure. So whenever the engine is putting bleed air into the cabin to pressurize it, that pressurized cabin air enters the filter and goes in this inlet, and then there's a valve in here that decides how much of it to let out to the outflow valve as a pneumatic signal. So that's how that's working. Now this section here is what's doing the heavy lifting. If you notice, there's 4 screws and there's a parting seam right here. So you take these screws off and this comes off, and this is what does all the work. So here we have one that's taken apart, so this comes off like that, and you notice that there is a plunger here that controls the opening and closing of the pneumatic valve, which decides how much air to let back to send back to the outflow valve. So from full open to full close is only a few millimeters here, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear it or not, but I'm going to blow air in the inlet so you can hear it go out the outlet when I press that open. It's normally closed. You press it, then it's open. So watch this. So I don't know if you could hear the air moving or not, but when you press it in, it opens that valve, and when you release it, it spring loads to the closed position. So that's what's doing the actual heavy lifting. Now what's controlling the opening and closing of this valve in order to control the pneumatic signal back to the outflow valve, when this is assembled, that little plunger rides on this disc. Now the disc itself, I don't know if you can see through this screen. Let's see if we can shine a light in here so that you might be able to see it more clearly. But if you look through that screen, you might be able to see that there's a bellows in there, an Aneroid bellows, which is a sealed compartment that is expandable or contractible. So there's a nitrogen charge in that sealed bellows which provides a reference. So as the cabin pressure is either higher than or lower than a certain reference point, that bellows will either expand or contract to either open or close further this valve. But there's more to it than just the Aneroid bellows, because if we take this off, we take the cover off, this shaft, which corresponds to the shaft in this dial here, the center dial, if you turn this shaft, that will also control this disc and move it either farther out or farther in, so that enables you to adjust the cabin pressure accordingly. So it's a combination of this Aneroid bellows that's filled with nitrogen and the position of this knob, which controls the in and out motion of this entire disc arrangement, this bellows with the disc on it. So if we look at this a little bit further, so this inner knob right here is directly connected to this shaft, and there's only one revolution, one turn from stop to stop. And if we were to do this in flight, our ears would really be hurting, because when you turn this inner knob on this particular controller, you are adjusting in real time the position of this valve, and the cabin pressure is going to change at the same rate you spin this valve. And remember, it's only got one turn from stop to stop. So if you have a desire to blow your eardrums out, that would be a way to do it. But how do we do this in normal operations so that it's easier on the ears? The way we do this, the mechanism that's in here, we'll talk about this in just a second. The mechanism that's in here is designed to keep this index mark always at 12 o'clock. So if you move this off at 12 o'clock, it's going to activate an electric motor and a gear set that will slowly turn this, and it will turn the inner knob and the outer dial together, and it will return it to the 12 o'clock position. If you move it this way, it's going to turn the motor the opposite way until that index mark is back at 12 o'clock. And that happens very, very slowly so that it's kind on your ears. Although you can adjust the speed of that by turning this knob. Standard is about 500 feet per minute of change. You can either decrease it or you can increase it. And all you're doing when you turn this knob is you're adjusting a potentiometer that will either speed up or slow down this motor. So if you look inside here, this is the knob that corresponds to the speed adjustment, and there's your potentiometer. So when you turn this knob over here, you're just adjusting this potentiometer, which either speeds up or slows down the electric motor accordingly. Now the electric motor here, if you look at this, we can't really disassemble this very well, but this electric motor is also, it's got a gear set that's not visible here. And that gear set outputs on this shaft right here. I don't know if you can see that, and that turns this first gear. And that gear is connected to this gear. So when the electric motor turns, it goes through a gear reduction in here, which greatly slows down the speed of rotation. And that's output on this gear here, which is then connected to this gear, and that's what turns this inner shaft. Now, when you put the outer knob at any position other than 12 o'clock, what happens is, this is what's underneath that dial, you can see that we've got a pair of micro switches here. So if you were to turn the dial counterclockwise to where the index mark is off at 12 o'clock in the counterclockwise direction, it's going to press this micro switch that way. And that's what tells the motor which direction to turn to return that index mark to 12 o'clock. If you were to go the other way and spin it clockwise off of the 12 o'clock position, that moves the micro switch in the opposite direction. So that tells the motor to turn in the opposite direction to bring that index mark back to the 12 o'clock position. So that's the nuts and bolts of how a Duke's pressurization controller works and how it decides how much pneumatic signal to send back to the outflow valve and how you can adjust it as well for your particular situation.